Okay, something I want to talk about today is something that I kind of accidentally stumbled upon when I was doing some research about who my patron saint would be. Um, Recently, I read a book called The Acquisition of the Holy Spirit in Ancient Russia by an author named Ivan Kontsevich. And in that book, he goes into the history of Russian monasticism from the 700s all the way to the 20th century. And he tracks both how monasticism developed as well as how Russian philosophy and Russia itself was formed surrounding that monasticism. Now, because that book covers such a long period of time, and because there is so many saints within that book that were mentioned, I had quite a few Russians that I was considering to make my patron saint. One of them was Sergius of Radonezh, who was a he was well known for his prayers in helping the Russian people win a victory in battle over enemies that were invading them. And interestingly enough, while he was praying, he delivered news of the battle being won to the people around him before he had heard any update. And I was particularly taken by that story, and I was considering him. But another person who I considered was Philip of Moscow, who was the Metropolitan of Moscow, who was murdered by the head of Ivan the Terrible's secret police. Now, in learning more about Philip, I was kind of sent on this historical rabbit hole about some things around the time of Ivan the Terrible. And I found out something pretty interesting about a schism that happened during that time between, well, it was within the Russian Orthodox Church itself. Now, the reason for the schism that happened was that there was a move to centralize the practices of the Russian Orthodox liturgy so that they more closely resembled the Byzantine practices. The reason for that, as far as I understood, was because there was an emphasis on trying to, there was a belief that, and a hope, that Russia would be the third Rome after Rome itself, then after Constantinople, where Constantinople was the center of the Christian world, and it was something like a Christian empire on earth for a few centuries. And so when Constantinople fell, there was an idea that Moscow would fulfill its place, and it would become something like the new center of a Christian empire on earth. And in order to more explicitly go after that vision, there was a desire to more closely structure the liturgy based off of the Byzantine liturgical practices. Now, there were those within Russia who did not want to make the liturgical practices more Byzantine because they wanted to adhere to a more distinctly Slavic way of practicing. And there was a schism that happened in the 1600s called the Raskol. And that word, Raskol in Russian, means something like a splitting apart. Now, the church became separated in a sense between the new believers who practiced the Byzantine rites as opposed to the old believers who believed in more of a Slavonic and a characteristically Slavic and Russian way of practicing the liturgy. Those who separated themselves were called the Raskolniks because they were the ones who separated themselves from this vision of Moscow as a third Rome and from this adherence to the Byzantine liturgy. Now, the word Raskolnik, as far as I understand, it's connected to the word Raskol, and it means those who split apart. Now, when I first read that, there was an idea that popped into my head that I thought was like the coolest thing ever when it first came to me, which was that it reminded me of Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment, where in Crime and Punishment, the plot is about a young man who's down on his luck, and he's in a pretty destitute and desperate place. And he finds himself pawning off his belongings in order to pay for rent and pay for schooling. And in doing so, he comes across the path of an evil old pawnbroker who takes advantage of everyone that comes to her who nobody likes. And he hatches a plan for how he can murder this woman and steal the money that she has, because he figures that no one likes her anyways, and her money, in a sense, would be better off in his hands, in the hands of somebody who is good, as opposed to an evil old woman. Now, he successfully carries out the murder, and he carries it out in such a way and with enough luck on his side that he's able to get away with the murder in the eyes of the law. Now, even though he gets away with it in the eyes of the law, we see that his conscience is completely tortured, and even though he is guiltless, his guilty conscience tortures him throughout the entirety of the book. And we spend the book learning really about what the true consequence of murder is, even if you get away with murdering in the eyes of the men around you, because no one knows. The main character of that book is Raskolnikov, and when I was reading about the schism in the 1600s and the Raskolniks, I immediately thought of him, because if Dostoevsky had that schism in mind at all, the character of Rodya Raskolnikov is literally the one who is splitting apart on the inside. And I thought that would be worth sharing.